Hello, everybody. I'm going to take a bit of a shift away from the sort of the ordinary crime to think about the continuing legacy of the troubles that many victims in Northern Ireland still face. This talk, I'll try and keep it maybe about 15 minutes, so we have more time for questions, draws on research we've been doing since maybe 10 years ago. And actually, 10 years ago, in this very same room, I gave a talk on the injured and the need to do redress for them. And I'll talk a little bit about that scheme and that scheme and its successes, but also its limits, and the ongoing debates in relation to the Legacy Act. This is sort of an ongoing process in terms of dealing with victims in Northern Ireland. We are, nearly 30 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and we still haven't dealt with the legacy of the Troubles. And this isn't just an issue of the past. This is a lot of people's everyday lives, their present. And when I think about legacy, I don't think about the past. I think about the future, about what a society we are leaving for our children and grandchildren and generations to come. Because for those who don't remember their own history, the Troubles in Northern Ireland didn't happen once in the last century, it happened twice. And there's a concern here that by failing to redress the grievances and the harm that was caused in the past, we're just going to repeat it. And I was driving through East Belfast and driving past what used to be the wall where Santayana's quote was that those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think a lot when it comes to bereaved, society has moved on from the Troubles. We are enjoying the peace, but that's not the same for everybody. And so the burden of the Troubles weighs quite heavily on those who are bereaved and injured. And we have had international interventions from the UN's top person on dealing with the past, Pablo de Graaff, and his successor. And there was 2 reports brought out in Northern Ireland, and those reports underscored there had been some progress, but that there was still, manifest problems with how, or the lack of, we were dealing with our past. And Northern Ireland is often showcased as a par excellence of peace building to the rest of the world. It's a negative piece, and the last few weeks haven't shown that there's still these ongoing grievances that can bubble up into violence. That I think by systematically and seriously dealing with the past, in particular reparations, it's the best way to sort of move forward. And what I mean by reparations aren't just about money. Compensation is a key part. It's all about rehabilitation. And a key thing is acknowledgement. A lot of people who had family members killed never had the acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong, or who was responsible for it, or even that they were a victim. And so, like last week in the news, there was numerous stories about ongoing litigation, settlements, and also inquest findings that sort of cleared families' names who had been tarnished with certain labels. And it had taken over 50 years for the families to get to that point, and that won't be the end of it. And so for me, I've worked in reparations in over a dozen countries. I've interviewed hundreds of victims, ex-combatants, soldiers, a range of actors. And Northern Ireland is quite a small victim population, and yet we get stuck up in the politics of it all, rather than finding solutions and just stuck on the problems. And so today I want to understand, why this continues to be a problem, and also talk about a solution. So we did a lot of archival research about how compensation payments were paid during the Troubles. In the mid-1960s, countries like New Zealand, England and Wales were introducing new statutory compensation schemes where if you were a victim of a crime, you could apply to get compensation. And in 1968, Northern Ireland adopted its own compensation scheme. But that was for ordinary crime. It was never built for the scale of violence that occurred. And it was based on people's income. So what they brought to their family and how family members were dependent on them. And so you have a situation where there's these vast discrepancies in the amount of money that's awarded. So between, in one case we found £43 a person was compensated for the death of a loved one, and up to the sort of higher end, over £100,000. Families all suffered a loss, but they weren't being recognised equally. And there were strong gender dimensions and class dimensions to that. Most people who were killed during the Troubles were young men between the age of 30, many of them unemployed, and many from working class backgrounds. So most victims didn't get much for the death of a loved one. And we did a whole range of analysis, and I've got a report we did about 3 years ago, sort of digs into that sort of data that we had access within the Department of Justice and also the Public Records Office. And we sort of try to analyse 1,000 cases. So in the first 10 years of the Troubles, between 1966 to 1976, half of all deaths occurred, and during that period you had this compensation scheme which didn't adequately compensate families. And so what that meant for a lot of families was that they were impoverished, they became poor, and children, siblings had to give up careers, had to give up education opportunities to look after other family members, or go out and work at a very young age. And this isn't just an historical issue. A friend who looks after my child, and she said to name her, Alison McGarry, her father was killed when she was 15. And her family was never adequately compensated, and she dropped out of school, and it had a lifelong impact on her. Decades of this bereavement that was never properly compensated. And so with the breakdown of it, most families got less than £5,000. So you had your family member killed, and you got less than £5,000. Some people got between £50 to £90, which just covered the coffin. And so we have been through this process and this rigmarole before about dealing with the past. The consultative group of the past, 15 years ago, made a number of recommendations. One of them was to compensate people for bereavement. And that sort of imploded around the politics around it, where people were saying that not all people who were killed are innocent or equal, or issues like that. The Irish government ran a similar scheme and paid, I think, around 100 individuals who were bereaved about €15,000. We missed an opportunity to compensate those who are bereaved. And the thing is, we have ran out of time because a lot of parents who had children killed, and going back to that point that most people were killed in the first 10 years of the Troubles, are now dead. Their siblings of those who were killed are in their 70s or 80s. And even the children of people who were killed in their 70s, 50 years on, are now in their 60s. So there's a real impact on victims that the state has done nothing and are just waiting for them to die. And this is a broader group than just those people who are getting inquests or prosecutions. Whatever happens with the Legacy Act, we're looking at going from what the police has been engaging with the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, a few dozen prosecutions. Even if those individuals are convicted, they'll only serve 2 years. So the vast majority of victims will not get acknowledgement or their day in court. And so compensation is a way of acknowledging that and sort of recognising their harm and providing some means to deal with it. 10 years ago, and I have had dozens of meetings in this building with the We Have Injured group and others around trying to get the injured scheme in place. It was put in place in 2020, 2021 when Stormont was on holiday. And the scheme itself has been somewhat of a success in the sense that it's had over 10,000 applications and has paid out, I think it's over £134 million to people who were injured during the Troubles. And these were people who were severely disabled. Many of them lost jobs, lost their homes, lost their careers, and also could never leave their homes because of psychological trauma, agoraphobia, a range of issues. And so this scheme has acknowledged their harm and given them some compensation to help new opportunities. The thing is, a number of people who were bereaved have went before the scheme saying, my family member was killed, and some have been able to get compensation. I would say it's a handful of individuals. One victim whose father was killed had a number of siblings, 9 siblings, and one of the siblings was there in the presence of their father dying, and so they were able to claim through this scheme. The other 8 siblings who weren't able to. So how do you deal with that sort of tension in families based on a scheme which isn't really created for bereaved? And so when we were advocating with the We Have Injured group for an injured scheme, having something for the bereaved was supposed to follow. It was supposed to be opening the door to bereaved victims who, haven't been able to benefit from these sort of schemes and sort of ongoing processes. And so the Victims Commission, the Commission for Victims and Survivors, in relation to the legacy, submitted evidence to the Northern Ireland Executive Office in January 2024. We are still waiting to see what's going to happen with that, but set out a range of points about how to move forward for bereaved. That this is something which the Victims Forum has been engaged with and supportive of, and there still has been no traction on sort of moving this issue forward. And there is some costings built in about how much this would look and how much it would cost over a number of years and a number of different options. So the thing is, we know what the problem is. We have got a range of solutions, and we have actually got some parliamentary draftsmen from Westminster to actually draft the legislation to implement this. And so I'm going to briefly talk about what that scheme would look like and what it would operate on. The scheme itself would work out a payment. So we have recommended between 20 to about 75,000 to bereaved family members, and we'll talk about who would actually be the beneficiaries of that. It would put it on a statutory basis, and so we have been looking at Westminster and thinking about the Legacy Act. How could we attach, like the injured scheme was attached to a piece of the executive bill in 2019, how could we attach that to the Legacy Act? The difficulty there is when dealing with the Legacy Act, it's no longer a focus on victims anymore. It's dealing with the veterans community, and it's a louder group of individuals who have legitimate issues, but they're putting a whole lot more pressure on Labour than any victims group here in Northern Ireland ever could. And that's a fundamental problem with this amended Legacy Act that's going forward, that the voices of those who are most affected by the Troubles are getting left behind. And so we have found very little political support for anybody putting their head above the parapet to support a bereaved scheme. And it seems absurd, because we're willing to spend over 250, maybe 300 or more million pounds on lawyers and investigators to investigate cases which mostly have been investigated before, with the hope of getting maybe some convictions of 30 to 40 individuals who will only serve at most 2 years in prison, and likely a few weeks after their conviction date if they're held on remand. It seems absurd. And as a lawyer, we shouldn't be lining the pockets of lawyers. We should be providing the money to those who are most affected. And I'm sure I'll hear about that later. But this is something that is a serious issue for people who are, still in our society and still living with the legacy of the Troubles. It hasn't gone away. And so this scheme could be easily done. It just needs political leadership. It's not likely now to come from Westminster, so is there a place then for Stormont in this? And the scheme itself, we've used some of the best parliamentary draftsperson to put together this piece of legislation. It is quite similar to the injured scheme, but it's a little bit more simpler because there's no need for the person to show disablement or level of injury. All they have to show is their family relation to the person who was killed. And we have lost lives, we have the Sutton Index, we've got police records of all the 3,600 or so individuals who were killed. So it's an easier evidential process. And the absurd thing is, in Northern Ireland, we could do that quite easily. I've worked in places like Iraq and Colombia, where you've got millions of victims, and they're far poorer than this place, and they're able to provide compensation to, like in Colombia's done over 1.2 million victims paid compensation to. It's got over 10 million victims, but it's still pushing forward in delivering this. In Northern Ireland, there's a way of doing this, and always it'll come up who's a victim and who's eligible for this. And this was always an issue with us when dealing with the injured scheme. It was a way of sort of closing down the conversation. It was either only for innocent victims or all victims should be treated equally. And we don't need to get into that politics, because we've got the Victims Payment Board, which deals with that on a daily basis. We put it into a legal statutory scheme, and there's powers for people with independence and guidance, including like the fundamental purpose, that the whole purpose of a payment scheme is to acknowledge the past. And so in Colombia, victims who had family members killed by state forces, paramilitaries, guerrillas, they get a letter acknowledging that their family member was killed and that they're a victim, and they're getting this money, this compensation as a result, and access to specialist, rehabilitative services. It's not complicated. And so the politics doesn't need to be the problem. There is solutions to how we can move forward in this, and we have done it repeatedly in the past. And so the scheme itself, what we would look to is not like the consultative group of the past about just getting it to one family member. We would look at sort of doing different categories. So in Spain, for victims of terrorism, they give is it 250,000 euros to the spouse and children, and it's half goes to the spouse and half to the children. There's easy ways you can sort of work this out and provide it. The scheme itself, as I've said, is quite more simplified than the injured scheme. And I think it's something that could be delivered sooner rather than later, because time is running out for victims of the Troubles. We aren't likely to get all the truth, and we're not likely to get full justice for the Troubles, but we can, at this time, provide recognition and acknowledgement for families who lost a loved one. And there is going to be difficult cases, people who injured themselves and died in incidents, people who were involved in killing others and died in instances, or even people who were on hunger strike. Those individuals and their families have benefited and being able to access other schemes within Northern Ireland, both presently and in the past. So these shouldn't be barriers to sort of moving forward. And really, it's going back to the fundamental purpose of what are we trying to do, what are we trying to build for our children and grandchildren and for societies in decades to come in this place, is that fundamentally we need to recognise that people died. Like, we lost 3,600 people or more in Northern Ireland. They're likely their children, their grandchildren will never exist because they died. Most of them were young men, unemployed, and without children. So we have had a massive loss to our society. And we look to other countries like Ukraine, Palestine, and elsewhere, and seeing the harm that has had on families. And yet we're not recognising how we can do better here in Northern Ireland and be actually just not a leader in how to do peace, but actually how to solidify and make peace sustainable for generations to come. And this isn't just a blip in between conflicts in this little place. So thank you for your attention, and I'm finished early.